The letter hit the floor of the sheriff's office like a stone dropped into still water, and Eva Atwood watched the ripples of it spread across Jacob Dalton's face. Shock, then recognition, then something so raw and broken she had to look away. "You knew," she said, and her voice did not shake, because she had taught herself years ago that shaking was a luxury she could not afford. "You knew who I was before I ever stepped foot in Sable Creek." Jacob stood behind his desk with his hat pressed flat against his chest, his jaw working like he was chewing on words that would not come out right no matter how he arranged them. The morning sun cut through the single dirty window of the office and drew a line of gold between them. A division, a border, a wound opened in the middle of a room that smelled like tobacco and old wood, and something Eva had foolishly started to think of as safety. "Eva, do not say my name like that." She pressed her fingers against the letter, the one she had found tucked under the loose floorboard in the back room of the Dalton homestead where she had been working for 4 months. 4 months of rising before dawn, to cook for 3 children who were not hers, but had started to feel like they were. 4 months of mending fences and hauling water and learning the names of every horse in the corral and every star visible from the back porch. 4 months of falling in love with a life that, it now turned out, had been arranged for her like a trap dressed up in kindness. The letter was dated 6 months before her arrival. It was addressed to Jacob Dalton, written in a hand she recognized with a jolt so violent it nearly took her knees out from under her, because it was her late mother's handwriting. Her mother, who had been dead for 2 years. Her mother, who had apparently written to a widowed rancher in the New Mexico territory, and described a daughter who would be left with nothing when the woman finally succumbed to the consumption eating her from the inside out. A daughter who was stubborn and proud, and would never accept charity but could work harder than any hired hand. A daughter who needed a home and a family more than she would ever be willing to admit. Her mother, who had been arranging Eva's entire future from her deathbed, without saying a single word about it. And Jacob Dalton, who had received that letter and placed an advertisement in 3 Eastern newspapers for a housekeeper, and then specifically, the letter made this unbearably clear, specifically chose Eva from the dozen letters of inquiry he received, because she was the one her mother had sent him to find. Eva felt the betrayal like a brand pressed to her chest, not of Jacob alone, of her mother too, of the life she thought she had chosen freely with her own hands and her own will. She had come west looking for work. She had not come west looking to be rescued or arranged or loved on someone else's terms. But God help her, she had been found anyway. She had been found long before she ever knew she was lost. It had been February of 1878 when Eva first decided to go west, and the decision had nothing romantic about it. She was 24 years old, standing in a boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, with $16.40 in her purse, a carpetbag containing everything she owned, and the fresh memory of her mother's funeral 3 weeks behind her like a cold wind at her back. There was no brother to write to. No father she had ever known. No aunts or cousins who could take her in with anything beyond strained politeness, and that particular expression that meant they were calculating the expense of her presence. She had tried that already 2 weeks with her mother's older sister in Columbus, who had a husband who looked at Eva with an interest that made her stomach turn and a house that was never going to be safe. She had left in the middle of the night with her carpetbag and not looked back. She was good with her hands. She could cook, clean, sew, mend, tend animals, manage a household, keep accounts, read and write better than most. She had helped nurse her mother through 2 years of slow dying, which meant she had also learned to operate entirely without sleep, to find solutions when there were no solutions, and to make something from nothing on a regular basis, because nothing was frequently all that was available. She saw the advertisement in a newspaper someone had left on a bench at the Cincinnati train station. Wanted, experienced housekeeper. Widower with 3 children ages 4, 7, and 9, requires capable woman for household management of ranch in Sable Creek, New Mexico territory. References preferred. Fair wages. Permanent position for the right applicant. Inquire to J. Dalton, Sable Creek, NM Territory. She had read it twice. Then she had gone to the writing desk in the station and composed a letter on the spot, using her last good sheet of paper, writing it in her neatest hand because she understood that a letter of inquiry was a form of currency, and she intended to spend it carefully. She told him the truth, because she had found that truth, plainly and confidently stated, served her better than embellishment. She told him she was 24, unmarried, with no family remaining. She told him her experience. She told him she was not afraid of hard work or hard weather, and that she had no illusions about ranch life being easy. She told him she was available immediately. She told him she required no adjustment period, because she had been adjusting to difficult circumstances her entire life. She posted it, and then she thought, well, there are other advertisements, and she wrote 5 more letters to 5 different positions over the next 3 days. But something about J. Dalton of Sable Creek stayed in the corner of her mind. His response came faster than she expected, 12 days, which was fast enough that the telegraph must have been involved at some point in the communication chain. It was brief. It told her he found her letter satisfactory, and that if she was still available and willing, she should take the train to Santa Fe and then the stage south to Sable Creek, and that he would reimburse her travel expenses from her first month's wages. The wage he offered was $8 per month, which was not generous but was not dishonest either. She went. She packed her carpetbag and her second bag, the one with the kitchen tools she had inherited from her mother, a good sharp knife, and a set of measuring spoons and a cast iron skillet that weighed a full 7 pounds and was worth every ounce, and she stepped onto a train heading west. The journey took 11 days in total, with 2 changes and the final stretch by stagecoach on roads that seemed to be made of pure ambition and dried optimism, because they were more suggestion than reality in certain stretches. She arrived in Sable Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in early March of 1878, with dust on every surface of her and her arms aching from bracing against the jolting of the coach, and she stood in the middle of what passed for a main street and took stock of the place she was supposed to make her home. Sable Creek was small in the way that western towns were small, compressed, and essential, and containing exactly what was needed, and not a great deal more. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that she could smell from where she stood, a small church that looked newer than everything around it, a sheriff's office with a hitching post out front, and a scattering of other establishments she catalogued automatically as a woman who had learned to read her environment the way some people read books. The land around it was wide and pale and enormous, with mountains in the far distance that made Cincinnati feel like a toy in comparison. She was still standing there adjusting to the altitude and the light when a buckboard wagon pulled up beside her, and a man climbed down from the seat, and she knew immediately it was him because he was looking for someone, and the way he scanned the street told her he was not entirely sure what he was looking for. Jacob Dalton was 31 years old in the spring of 1878. He was built the way the western landscape had apparently made its preference known in men, broad through the chest and shoulders, lean everywhere else, weathered in the way that came from years of outdoor labor rather than aging. He had dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of good strong coffee and a jaw that had not met a razor in at least 3 days. He was wearing a working man's clothes, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, worn boots, and a sheriff's badge on his chest that caught the afternoon light and told her something she had not known from his advertisement. He saw her. Something passed over his face that she could not name then but would think about later, recognition, or something like it, and she had assumed at the time it was simply the recognition of spotting the person you were expecting to meet. "Miss Atwood," he said. "Mr. Dalton," she said. They shook hands like 2 people completing a business transaction, which was precisely what it was, and she noticed that his handshake was firm and direct, and he did not hold on a moment longer than necessary, which she appreciated, because she had encountered enough men who used a handshake as an opportunity for something else entirely. "Wagon's here," he said. "Long ride out to the ranch. You up to it?" "I got here from Cincinnati," she said. "I think I can manage a wagon ride." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something. He loaded her bags himself, and they drove out of Sable Creek in the afternoon light, heading south and west into the wide, pale country, and he told her about the ranch in the same way she had written her letter, straightforwardly, without embellishment, as if he had decided that the cleanest form of communication was honesty, and he had made his peace with that. The Dalton ranch was 400 acres. He ran cattle, a modest herd, about 60 head. He also had horses, which he bred and sold, and that was where the real money came from, he said, because horses were a commodity the territory could not get enough of. He had a full-time hand named Rooster, who was 60-something and had been with the Dalton family since Jacob's father's time. He had 3 children, Samuel, who was 9, Clara, who was 7, and little Ben, who had just turned 4 in January and apparently still woke up crying at night sometimes, a detail that Jacob delivered in a tone so carefully neutral that Eva understood immediately how much it cost him to admit it. His wife had died. He did not say how. Eva did not ask, because she knew that widowed men in the West often carried their losses like a second skin they could not take off, and asking was not necessarily the same as helping. What she did ask, because it was relevant, was, "Are the children difficult?" He considered this question seriously, which she noted and respected. "Samuel is angry about things," he said. "He is 9, so he is not always sure what things, but there is a good deal of anger. Clara is—" he paused. "Clara is watching everything. She is very quiet and she watches. I am told this is normal. Ben is 4, so he is difficult in the way that all 4-year-olds are difficult, which is to say in all possible directions at once." Eva had looked at the open land going by on either side of the wagon and thought, "These are things I can work with. Anger I understand. Quiet watchers I understand. And small boys who cry at night, those I understand perhaps best of all, because she had been a child who needed someone steady in the dark and had not always had it." "All right," she had said. "All right," he had repeated. "All right, I can manage," she had said. "That is what I'm here for." He had glanced at her then with an expression she did not have time to read before he looked back at the road, and they had ridden the rest of the way in a silence that was, she noticed, not uncomfortable. The ranch, when they arrived, was in the state of a household managed by a man who was doing his best and whose best was genuinely impressive in the areas where he had knowledge, and significantly less impressive in the areas where he did not. The structures were all solid and well-maintained. The barn was in excellent shape. The corral was strong. The fencing around the near pasture was taut and even. The house, however, was a different matter. Not dirty exactly, but disordered in that particular way of a home without a homemaker, where everything worked but nothing was quite in its right place, and the meals, she would discover, consisted of a rotating series of beans and cornbread and salt pork that had been sustaining life, but not much else. She met the children in the yard. Samuel stood back with his arms crossed and gave her a look that was designed to be intimidating, and was, in fact, exactly as intimidating as a 9-year-old boy was capable of making it, which is to say it was mostly heartbreaking. Clara stood a little behind her brother with her enormous brown eyes fixed on Eva as if trying to solve a problem. Ben came trotting around the corner of the house with mud on his boots and one suspender hanging off his shoulder, and he looked at Eva with the complete and uncritical openness of very small children and said, "Are you going to make food?" "I am," Eva said. "Good," he said. "Papa's food is not very good." "Ben," Jacob said. "It isn't," Ben said. And Samuel, despite himself, had made a sound that was almost a laugh before he reassembled his armor of suspicion. Clara had watched Eva watch that moment, and something in Clara's expression had shifted infinitesimally, the way a door moves when the wind changes direction. Eva had made biscuits for supper that first night, and a proper stew with vegetables from the last of the root cellar stores, and dried apple dumplings for something sweet, because she had brought apples from the last station stop, and a block of sugar in her carpetbag, because she had learned that sweetness was a form of communication that worked across most language barriers, including the language barrier between a woman who was a stranger and 3 children who did not yet know if she was safe. Ben had eaten 2 bowls of stew and 3 biscuits and fallen asleep at the table. Samuel had eaten in silence and then said, quietly, as if admitting it cost him something, "It was good." Clara had said nothing, but she had eaten everything on her plate and looked at Eva once more before taking herself off to bed, and that look had said, "You might do." Jacob had helped her carry the sleeping Ben to his bed, and they had stood for a moment in the narrow hallway of the house with the small weight of the child between them like a shared secret, and Jacob had said, "Thank you, Miss Atwood," in a voice that was the voice of a man who was genuinely, quietly desperate and had been for a long time, and Eva had said, "That is what I am here for," again, because it was the truth and also because she did not have words yet for the other thing she was feeling. Which was that for the first time since her mother had gotten sick, something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years had released by one small, careful degree. The weeks unfolded like this: work and more work, and the slow, complicated business of becoming known. Eva reorganized the kitchen within the first week, which required negotiating with Jacob about where he had stored things and why, a conversation that went better than she expected because she was discovering, a man who had opinions about where things went but was capable of being persuaded by logic. She reorganized the root cellar. She established a laundry day and a baking day and a mending basket. She learned which of the 3 children needed what kind of mourning. Samuel needed to be left alone until he had been awake for half an hour and had something to eat, after which he was approachable and occasionally even pleasant. Clara needed 5 minutes of quiet conversation about something concrete and real before she could face the day. Ben needed to be told the plan, all of the plan, in order, before anything began, or the resulting chaos could set the tone for the entire morning in ways that were difficult to recover from. She learned that Jacob Dalton was the sheriff of Sable Creek in addition to running the ranch, which meant he was gone to town 3 or 4 days a week, and left Rooster nominally in charge of the outdoor work while Eva managed everything else. She learned that Rooster was a man of profound few words and deep, uncomplicated kindness, who brought her wildflowers from the hillside on Fridays without comment and checked the water pump without being asked, and was, she suspected, watching over her in his own quiet way as if she needed looking after, which she also suspected she did not, but which she found she did not mind. She learned that Jacob had a habit of coming in from the range or from town late in the afternoon, when the children were occupied or had finished their lessons, and stopping in the kitchen doorway as if he did not quite know how to enter a room that had been transformed into something domestic and full and warm. She learned that he took his coffee black and his supper seriously, and that he was, when he allowed himself to relax even slightly, capable of a dry, understated humor that she found consistently more surprising and more funny than she ever anticipated. She learned that he had a habit of working after the children went to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with his accounts or his papers, or the correspondence that came with being a sheriff in a territory that was, in 1878, still in the process of deciding what it was going to be. She started staying up too, nominally because she had mending or bread to set for the following morning, but eventually she was honest enough with herself to admit that she stayed up because those quiet hours at the kitchen table, with the lamp between them and the night pressing at the windows, were her favorite hours of the day. They talked. That was all it was at first, practical talk, about the children and the ranch and the goings-on in town that Jacob would report with the careful evenness of a man who saw everything and tried to hold a fair opinion. He told her about the disputes and the difficulties, about the growth pressures on the territory as the railroad pushed closer, and more people arrived with more needs and more conflicts. He told her about the families he knew and the history of the land, and the complicated weave of Apache, Mexican, and American interests that made Sable Creek a place of constant negotiation. She told him things in return. She told him about Cincinnati and about nursing her mother, and about the boarding house and the train, and about what it was like to be a woman traveling alone west when everyone you met on the journey had an opinion about whether that was wise or proper or safe, and she had a sufficient opinion of her own to make those conversations mercifully brief. She made him laugh twice in the first month, genuine laughter, not the polite kind, and each time it had startled him, as if he had forgotten that his own face could do that. What she did not tell him, because she was still working it out herself, was that she had started dreaming about the ranch. Not anxious dreams, not the formless, worried dreams of a person adrift, but specific and settled ones, dreams in which she knew where everything was because it was exactly where she had put it, in which the sound of the children at breakfast was the first sound of the day, and it was good, in which the wide pale land out the kitchen window was simply the view she had always known. She did not tell him that she had stopped thinking of Sable Creek as the place she was currently working, and had started thinking of it as, quietly, against her will and better judgment, the place she had been heading for without knowing it. She did not tell him that she had started, with great caution and considerable alarm, to be in love with him, because she was not there for that. She was there to work. She was not there to impose herself on a life that already had its shape and its grief and its delicate, careful process of healing. She was an employee, and she was professional, and she had standards, and one of those standards was that she did not complicate professional arrangements with feelings she had no business having. She kept all of this from him beautifully, right up until the morning she found the letter. She had been looking for the title documents to one of the near pastures, because Jacob had asked her to find them while he was in town, explaining they were in the back room in the loose board near the window where he kept important papers. She had found the title documents. She had also found the letter. She had also found, beneath the letter, two more, one of which was her own letter of inquiry, which she had sent from the Cincinnati train station, and beside it in her mother's handwriting a note that said only, "This is the one. Eva, my Eva, please take care of her." She sat on the floor of that back room for a very long time with the papers in her hands, and the sound of Ben playing in the yard outside, and Clara practicing her letters at the table in the main room, and Rooster singing something tuneless to himself in the barn, and she felt the world rearrange itself around her into a shape she had not chosen. Her mother had known Jacob Dalton, or known of him. The letter, dated April of 1877, was not a stranger's letter. It was the letter of someone who knew enough details about Jacob Dalton, about his wife's death, about his children, about his character, to speak of him with the specificity of connection. Her mother had grown up in Missouri before moving east, and there was reference in the letter to shared acquaintances, to a family name Eva recognized from her mother's occasional stories about her own childhood, and she began to piece it together slowly the way you piece together a picture from its edges. Her mother had known someone who knew Jacob's family, had known that Jacob was a good man and a desperate one, had known that her daughter was going to be left alone, and that alone, for Eva, was the most dangerous state possible, not because Eva was fragile, but because Eva's response to being alone was to make herself harder and smaller and more independent until she took up as little space as possible in the world. And her mother had understood that her daughter's greatest secret, kept the thing she would never admit she needed, was to belong somewhere, to someone, to a family that would hold her as she had always held everyone else. So she had written a letter, and she had died. And Jacob Dalton had placed an advertisement and chosen Eva Atwood from 12 letters of inquiry, And Eva had ridden 3 days west in a stagecoach thinking she had made a free and independent choice, when in fact she had been walked, like a piece on a chessboard, directly to the place her mother had decided she needed to be. She walked to the sheriff's office with the letters in her hand, and she was very, very calm, the way she got calm when something cracked her open, because falling apart was still, even now, a luxury she refused. The confrontation had lasted 45 minutes, and during those 45 minutes several things happened that Eva had not anticipated. Jacob told her everything, not deflecting, not qualifying, not deploying the particular male evasiveness she had braced for. He put his hat on his desk and he looked at her directly and he told her the truth in the straightforward way that was. She was furious to realize one of the things she loved most about him. He had known her mother's family years ago through a cousin of his father's. He had known Eva's mother by reputation, as a formidable woman who had raised a formidable daughter but had not known her personally. When her mother's letter arrived in the spring of 1877, he had been 7 months a widower and he was, he said, plainly, drowning. Not in grief alone, he was capable of managing grief, but in the practical reality of 3 children who needed their lives to continue, and a ranch that required constant management, and a job that demanded his presence in town, and no way to do all of it at once without something going catastrophically wrong. He had received 11 other letters of inquiry in response to his advertisement. He had read Eva's letter last. He said he had read it 3 times before he understood why it felt so different from the others, which was that it was written without any performance. Most people applying for a position, he said, were performing. They were showing the best and most appealing version of themselves. Eva's letter had not done that. It had simply stated what she was capable of and what her circumstances were, with a directness that was either extraordinary confidence or the particular clarity of someone who has been down to the bedrock of themselves and decided that honesty was less exhausting than its alternative. He had written back before he had made a conscious decision to do so. Had he intended to tell her? Eva had asked, and this was the question that cost him something, because she could see it cost him when he answered. He had intended to tell her before she arrived, he said. Then before the end of the first week. Then before the first month was out. But each time he came close to it, the moment presented itself as the moment he might lose her, might have her pack her carpetbag and take the next stage east, and he had not been able to risk it. Not for his sake, he said quickly, but for the children's sake. She was the first person since their mother died who had made the Dalton house feel like a home again, and he had not been able to risk their losing that. And you, Eva said, is that what you are saying, that your own feelings were not involved? The silence that followed was long enough to change the nature of everything. No, Jacob said finally. That is not what I am saying. She stood in the middle of his office with the letters in her hand and the morning sun laying that gold line between them, and she was angry and she was afraid and she was, underneath both of those, something else entirely. Something that felt like the moment before lightning, when the air itself is charged with what is about to happen. My mother arranged my life, she said. Your mother loved you, he said. That was not an arrangement. That was a last act of love for someone she could not stop worrying about. She did not have the right, no, he agreed. She did not have the right, and I should have told you from the first day. Those are true things. He moved around his desk, not toward her but beside it, like a man who understood that advancing was wrong but retreating was also wrong, and there was only this. Eva, I need you to hear the other true thing, which is that I do not keep you there because of your mother's letter or because of my children's need or because of what I owe a promise made to a woman who is gone. He stopped. Tried again. I would have chosen you, he said. Of the 12 letters, I would have chosen yours even if your mother had never written to me. And if you had never arrived, if you had chosen one of the other 5 positions you applied for, yes, I saw those letters in your trunk. I apologize, I was not spying. The trunk fell and you saw those letters. The trunk fell, he said. Eva pressed her fingers to her mouth to stop whatever was rising in her from coming out because she genuinely could not tell if it was fury or laughter or something too large to be either. "You are the worst man," she said. "I know it," he said. "Eva, I need you to know that I would have found you. I believe that with everything I have. Not because your mother asked me to. Because you are the kind of person that a man like me finds once if he is very lucky and spends the rest of his life either grateful for or grieving over, depending on what he does when he has the chance. And I would very much like not to grieve you." Eva Atwood had survived the death of her father before she knew him, and the slow death of her mother, and 2 years of nursing, and a boarding house, and a lecherous uncle, and 11 days of westward travel, and 4 months of building a home inside someone else's house while pretending she had no stake in it. She had survived all of that by being harder than whatever came at her. But Jacob Dalton, standing in his dusty sheriff's office looking at her like she was the thing he would be most sorry to lose, that was the thing that finally cracked her all the way open. She did not cry. She very nearly did, and she did not because she was Eva Atwood, and that was still the truth of her even when she was breaking. But she let out a breath that she felt had been stored in her chest for 4 months, or possibly 4 years, and she said, "You cannot make decisions for me. Not you. Not my mother's memory. Not anyone. I need that to be completely understood." "Completely understood," he said, "and there will be no more hidden things. Whatever you know about me or about my mother or about anything else that concerns me, you tell me, all of it, from this point forward. All of it," he said, "and you are going to tell me the rest," she said. Everything she said in that letter, every word, tonight at the kitchen table. "Tonight," he agreed. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the letters carefully and put them in her apron pocket and walked to the office door and said, over her shoulder, without turning around, "The children will be back from Roosters by noon. Don't be late for supper." She did not wait to see his face. But she heard him exhale a sound like a man who had been holding his breath under water and had just reached the surface. And she carried that sound with her all the way home. The week that followed was the most honest week Eva had ever spent with another person. He told her about her mother's letter. He read every word of it to her at the kitchen table that night after the children were asleep, and Eva sat with her hands flat on the table and listened to her mother's voice come back to her through another person's reading of it. And it was one of the most painful and most beautiful things she had ever experienced, because her mother had known her so well. Every true thing her mother had written about her, the stubbornness, the pride, the capability, the deep and well-defended need to be needed, the terror of dependence, the love she had always been best at giving to children and to animals and to the difficult and the lost, all of it was true. And hearing it in Jacob's careful voice while the lamp burned low between them was like being seen completely for the first time. She told him things in return. She told him about her father, or the absence of him. She told him about growing up with a mother who was the most formidable human being she had ever encountered and the most beloved, and how those two things were connected rather than in conflict. She told him about the 2 years of nursing and what it had done to her, not broken her. Nothing had broken her, but rearranged her priorities into something that was more essential and less adorned, the way a fire clears the ground for what will grow next. She told him she was angry with her mother and loved her desperately, and was going to have to spend a significant amount of time reconciling those two facts, and he had listened to all of it with the quality of attention that was, she had decided, his most remarkable characteristic. The ability to be fully present with another person's truth without trying to fix it or rearrange it or make it more comfortable for himself. She told him because she had committed to honesty, and she intended to honor that commitment even when it was terrifying, that she was in love with him. She said it plainly, the way she wrote letters and managed households and everything else, without performance, without ornament, without anything except the bare fact of it laid down between them on the table like an honest account. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I have known for some time. I've been trying not to take advantage of it. And you thought hiding my entire personal history from me was not taking advantage of it, she said. I thought. He stopped. Then he said, very quietly, I thought if I told you and it drove you away, I would never forgive myself for being the one who lost the woman my children needed. And if I told you and it did not drive you away, I would not be able to trust that you stayed for the right reasons. Eva looked at him steadily across the table. And now you know everything, he said, and you are still here, so I would like to ask if you will consider if there is any possibility that you might— Jacob, she said. Yes. Ask me. He looked at her. His hands, she noticed, were pressed flat on the table the same way hers were, as if they both needed the solid surface beneath them for what was happening. Will you stay, he said, not as my housekeeper, as my wife, as the mother of my children for as long as they need one and beyond that too. As the person I would very much like to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. Eva Atwood, who had come west looking for work and found something she had not known how to want, said yes. They were married in the Sable Creek Church in early June of 1878, on a morning when the high desert was flowering with everything that bloomed after the spring rains, and the small white building was full of people Eva had spent 4 months meeting one at a time, and had not realized until the moment she stood in the doorway looking at them, all gathered together, constituted the community she had not known she was building. Rooster stood up front with his hat pressed to his chest and an expression of gruff satisfaction that was the closest he ever came to demonstrating emotion. The Caldwell family from the neighboring ranch sat in the second pew. Martha Caldwell, who had made it her personal project to ensure Eva knew every woman in the surrounding territory and had succeeded with characteristic efficiency, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Doc Hensley, who had been treating the Dalton children's various ailments with a steady hand and an inexhaustible supply of peppermint sticks for the distraction of small patients, sat in the back with his wife. The children had been given roles. Samuel, who had spent the 2 months since Eva's confrontation with Jacob transforming his guarded suspicion into something more complex and more honest, a kind of watchful hope that he had not yet fully let himself believe in, was in charge of the rings. He carried out this responsibility with a seriousness of purpose that made Eva's heart do something complicated. Clara, who had been slowly, methodically, and thoroughly deciding that Eva was trustworthy since approximately day 3, had made a wreath of wildflowers for Eva's hair with a focus and care that suggested she had been planning it for weeks. Ben had been told his job was to stand still and be quiet, and his success in this endeavor was partial, but the parts where he forgot to be still and quiet involved him trotting over to Eva every few minutes to check that she was still there, which she found she did not mind at all. Jacob waited for her at the front of the church in a clean dark coat she had not seen before and a collar that was properly white for the first time since she had known him. And when he looked at her coming down the aisle on Rooster's arm, because there was no one else for that particular role and Rooster had accepted the assignment with a kind of quiet dignity that told her it meant something to him. The expression on Jacob's face was the expression of a man who had been given something he had not been sure he had the right to ask for, and he did not look away from her for a single moment until the ceremony was finished, and she was his wife, and he was her husband, and the whole small church exhaled. He kissed her once carefully, with the children watching and the congregation watching and the high desert sun coming through the windows and turning everything gold, and it was a promise made in public, and she intended him to keep it. He did. The summer of 1878 was the summer Eva Dalton. She made the name her own the way she made everything her own, by choosing it fully and without reservation, learned what it was to belong to a family that had already been waiting for her. She learned it in 1,000 small ways. She learned it in the way Samuel, by August, was bringing her rocks he found interesting in the way that 9-year-old boys who trust you bring you the things they value, which is to say depositing them silently on the kitchen windowsill, and then finding somewhere else to be, so that the acknowledgement of the gift would not require him to sustain eye contact. She learned it in the way Clara began, gradually and with immense deliberateness, to take Eva's hand when they walked anywhere together, initiating the contact herself rather than waiting for it to be offered, which Eva understood was a form of tremendous courage from a child who had learned that the people you reach for can be taken away. She learned it in Ben, who had decided approximately 2 days after the wedding that Eva was simply and permanently his, in the way of very small children who do not have philosophical objections to love. He came to her with everything, scraped knees and imaginary dragons, and the daily injustice of being 4 years old in a world that kept telling him he was too small for what he wanted to do. And he said "mama" with the complete ease of someone for whom language is simply a tool for getting what you need. And the first time he said it, Eva was in the middle of stirring something on the stove, and she had to stop and collect herself for a moment before she could answer him. She learned it in Jacob. She learned it in the way he was in the mornings, which was different from the way he had been before, less careful, less contained, as if the careful containment had been a form of protection for something that no longer needed protecting. He had begun kissing her in the kitchen when no one was looking, and sometimes when everyone was looking, and Ben found this extremely funny and Samuel found it deeply embarrassing in the way of 9-year-olds, and Clara watched it with the expression of someone collecting data that was coming out positive. He had begun talking to her about things he had previously kept internal, about the difficulties of his job, about the growth and tensions in the territory, about the things that troubled him and the things that gave him hope, about the future of the ranch and the children and the particular dream he had, which was that Samuel might go east for schooling when he was older if Samuel wanted it, and that Clara might have real choices about what her life became, and that Ben will probably just do exactly what he wants regardless, Jacob said once, with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and profound admiration, and Eva had laughed until she had to sit down. She learned it in herself. She learned that the hard shell she had grown over 2 years of nursing and loss and independence was not her actual self. It was armor, and good armor, and she was grateful to it. But armor is for the outside of things, and the inside of Eva Dalton turned out to be softer and more wanting than she had allowed herself to know. She found herself wanting things, not material things, but the rich, uncomplicated things that people need, which are presence and belonging and the ordinary miracle of being known. By the fall of 1878 she was deeply, thoroughly, specifically happy, and she recognized the feeling for what it was with some surprise, because she had not been sure it was a thing that would happen to her. And then the fall brought new complications, as falls in the territory tended to do. The sheriff's work had been a consistent undercurrent in their lives, Jacob's absences, his responsibilities, the occasional tension that came from managing law and order in a town that was still finding the boundary between the two. But in October of 1878, a dispute that had been building between 2 ranching families on the eastern edge of Sable Creek's territory escalated in the specific way that Western disputes escalated when too much land and too much pride and too little water were involved. And Jacob came home one evening with a set to his shoulders that Eva had learned to read as serious trouble. He sat at the kitchen table after supper and told her plainly, because they had agreed to no hidden things, that there had been shots fired at the Morrow Ranch, and that while no one was killed, there was a man badly enough injured that Doc Hensley was unsure, and that the Bellward family on the other side of the dispute had made statements that Jacob had been required to take seriously as potential threats, and that he expected the next several weeks to be difficult. Eva had listened to all of it and then said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her with that expression, the one she had first seen in the church and now knew as the expression he wore when she did something that reminded him of how lucky he was. "I need you to stay close to the ranch for a while," he said. I need you not to go into town without me or Rooster." "All right," she said. "That is all, no argument." "You are the sheriff," she said. "I trust your judgment on what constitutes a genuine threat. If you say stay close to the ranch, I will stay close to the ranch." "I am not agreeable, Jacob. I am strategic. Those are different things." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and said nothing, which was sometimes the most eloquent thing he did. The dispute ran its complicated course over the following weeks. Jacob managed it with the combination of law and diplomacy and sheer stubborn patience that were his professional signature, bringing both families to the table repeatedly, involving the county judge who came up from Las Cruces at Jacob's formal request, documenting everything with a thoroughness that was both legal instinct and personal principle. There were tense nights, and there were nights when Eva lay awake listening to the silence of the ranch and running through contingencies in her mind, because that was what she did with fear. She organized it and planned for it and made it manageable. The Bellward Morrow dispute was resolved, ultimately, by the intervention of a water rights survey that Jacob had quietly commissioned from Santa Fe 3 weeks into the conflict, which demonstrated definitively that the disputed creek ran on federal land, and that both families' claims to it were therefore equally invalid, a result that redirected both families' considerable ire toward the federal government and away from each other, which was not a perfect solution, but was a functional one. The man who had been injured recovered, and Jacob came home the evening of the final negotiation and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed his face into his hands for a long moment, and Eva sent the children outside and sat across from him and let him be tired without trying to fix it, because sometimes that was the form of love that was needed. "All right," she said when he lifted his head. "All right," he said. "Better than all right. Done." She got up and poured him coffee and put a piece of the dried peach pie she had made that morning in front of him and sat back down and said, "Tell me about it." And he did. He told her all of it, and she listened to all of it, and by the time he had finished, the set had gone out of his shoulders and the color had come back to his face, and he looked at her across the pie plate and the coffee cups with an expression so full of something she had no single word for, because love was not quite enough of a word for what Jacob Dalton wore when he looked at Eva, that she sometimes had to look away to let him have it. That winter, Eva discovered she was carrying their first child. She told Jacob on a Sunday morning in December, snow coming down outside the kitchen window for the first time she had ever seen snow in the territory, which was rare enough that all 3 children were pressed against the glass watching it. She told him quietly, just the 2 of them in the kitchen for a moment before the children came flooding back in, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession: surprise, then a joy so uncomplicated and total that it transformed his face into something she had not seen before, something young and unguarded and completely open. He held her. He held her in the kitchen with the snow coming down and the children's voices at the window, and he held her the way a person holds something they are afraid to break and simultaneously something they cannot believe they get to keep, and she felt the solidity of him all the way through. "A boy," he said into her hair. "I have no way of knowing that yet," she said, "and if you have a preference, I suggest you keep it entirely to yourself." He laughed, that genuine, startled laugh that she had been collecting since her first week at the ranch. "No preference," he said. "None whatsoever. Healthy. That is the only preference." "Agreed," she said. Samuel, when they told the children at supper, reacted with a kind of studied casualness that did not conceal at all the fact that he had quietly, privately wanted this for some time. "All right," he said. "I suppose that's all right." He ate 3 extra helpings of supper and spent the evening doing his lessons with unusual diligence, which was Samuel's way of celebrating things he did not want to be seen celebrating. Clara had asked 3 precise questions. When, where would the baby sleep, and would it be loud? And upon receiving satisfactory answers had nodded once and returned to her book. though she kept looking up from it for the rest of the evening with an expression of suppressed excitement that she apparently believed she was managing invisibly. Ben had announced immediately and with great confidence that it was going to be a brother, and that his name should be Buck, and that Buck would be his responsibility, and that they should begin preparing Buck's room at once. "His name will not be Buck," Eva said. "Maybe it will be a girl," Jacob offered. Ben considered this for approximately 4 seconds. "Her name should be Buck," he said. Jacob kept his expression admirably neutral and Eva did not. The pregnancy was, on balance, easier than she expected. She slowed down, eventually, with some resistance, and after Jacob and Rooster and Clara all deployed the specific variety of concern that was the most effective at reaching her, which was the practical kind rather than the worried kind. She had been accustomed to doing everything herself and had to make the deliberate choice, repeatedly, to accept help, which was possibly the longest-running project of her life in the territory. But she made it. By late spring, the Dalton house had become what her mother's letter had apparently envisioned, and what Eva had never let herself articulate: full, warm, loud in the specific pleasant way of a family that was not quiet about being alive. Samuel had finally, by some internal process that 9-year-olds undertook on their own schedule, decided that he loved Eva in the total and uncomplicated way rather than the careful, conditional way, and the evidence of this was that he had stopped being careful. He argued with her about things. He brought her his actual problems rather than his manageable ones. He told her once, in a voice designed to be offhand but that she could hear was neither, that he was glad she had come, and she had told him with equal offhandedness that she was glad too, and they had both looked somewhere else for a moment and then gotten on with what they were doing. Clara had, by spring, ceased treating Eva's presence as something to be evaluated and had simply incorporated it, the way clever children incorporate useful facts thoroughly, without fanfare, permanently. She started coming to Eva with the problems she would previously have tried to solve alone, which was a remarkable thing to observe because Clara's problems were thoughtful and complicated, and she listened to Eva's responses with the careful attention of someone taking genuine notes. Ben had named every horse on the property Buck, which was confusing. The baby was born in July of 1879, on the hottest day of the summer, with Martha Caldwell attending and Doc Hensley present and Jacob in the room because Eva had informed him she required his presence, and she was not in the mood for argument on the subject. And when it was over and the baby was placed in Eva's arms and Jacob was beside her with his hand in her hair, it was a boy, born healthy and loud and thoroughly present. With Jacob's dark eyes and Eva's expression of determined focus, which was an expression that Eva observed in him approximately 14 minutes after his birth and never stopped finding remarkable. They named him Thomas, not Buck. Thomas James Dalton, James for Eva's grandfather, the only family name she had kept from a history that was otherwise mostly lost. Thomas was 17 days old when Samuel, sitting at the kitchen table with his chin in his hands watching Eva nurse the baby, said quietly without looking up, "I used to be angry that Mama died. For a long time I was angry at everybody, at Papa most, but at you too when you came, because you were here and she wasn't." Eva was quiet, waiting. "I'm not any more," Samuel said, "angry at you. I stopped being angry at you a while ago. I wanted you to know that I'm not." "Thank you, Samuel," Eva said. "That means a great deal to me." He nodded once, the way his father nodded when something was concluded and settled. Then he said, "Does Thomas always make that sound or just sometimes?" "Always," Eva said. "So far always." Said Samuel and went back to his reading. Clara brought Thomas a pressed flower every morning for the first month of his life, placing it precisely on the edge of his cradle with a seriousness of purpose that suggested she had given this gift protocol considerable thought. When Thomas, at 3 weeks, reached out and wrapped his fingers around one of Clara's with the uncritical grip of brand-new babies, Clara looked at Eva with an expression of pure wonder that Eva would remember for the rest of her life. A child, discovering that love, when given openly, comes back. The months turned over, and each one brought something new. In the spring of 1880, Jacob ran for re-election as sheriff of Sable Creek, and won by a margin that said something true about how the town had come to see him, not just as the man with the badge, but as the man whose word could be trusted, whose judgment was sound, whose commitment to the community was not a pose. Eva stood in the crowd outside the town hall when the results were announced and felt something that was pride and also deeper than pride, something close to the recognition of a man's character being correctly seen by the world, which is a particular satisfaction. She had become, by 1880, a figure in Sable Creek in her own right, in the way that capable women become figures in small communities when they are willing to apply their capability to things beyond their own households. She helped Martha Caldwell establish a lending library, 10 books initially, borrowed from everyone in the territory who owned any, housed in a corner of the general store, that grew by the end of its first year to 38 volumes and had a waiting list. She organized a school rotation in the years before Sable Creek could afford a dedicated school teacher, which meant rotating among the homes of families who could house a learning period, and she taught 3 mornings a week herself, which was more than she had expected and less than was needed and still something. She had begun, in the evenings, writing. It had started as letters. She was a compulsive and detailed letter writer, sending accounts of life in the territory to the handful of people from her Cincinnati life who had maintained contact, and had expanded into something she did not have a name for at first, which was the recording of things, the landscape, the communities. She was learning to understand the Mexican families who had been in the territory for generations before the American presence arrived, and who navigated that shifting reality with a patience and complexity she found humbling. The Apache families whose situation was one that Eva could not think about without the specific anger of someone who understood the difference between law and justice, and found them frequently in conflict. Jacob, when he found her writing one night, actually found her, literally came in from a late ride and saw her bent over the pages at the kitchen table, had read over her shoulder for several minutes before saying anything, and what he said was, "You should send this somewhere. It is not finished. The part about the water rights survey is better than anything I wrote in the official report. That is a low bar," she said. "Your official report was written at midnight." 2 in the morning, he said. "Eva, I want you to keep doing this." She looked up at him. "I intend to. I'm not asking permission." "No," he said. "That is not what I meant." He leaned down and kissed her on the top of her head in the way he did when she said something that delighted him without his quite knowing what to do with the delight. "I meant I am glad you are doing this. I am glad you have this. I am glad for all of it." "Sit down," she said. "You have been on a horse for 8 hours. Sit down." "I love you," he said. "I know it," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She pushed the coffee pot toward him and went on writing. The second pregnancy she discovered in the early winter of 1880, and this time she told him differently. She had been more deliberate about it, had waited for a particular evening when the children were asleep, and the fire was good, and they were both sitting close together the way they had learned to sit in the long evenings of the territory winter. And she told him straight out, the way she told him everything, and he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You are remarkable." "I am not," she said. "I am simply, you are remarkable," he said again, quieter. "You came here not knowing a single person. You came here because you needed work and you did not want anyone's charity. And look," he gestured somehow at all of it, at the house, at the sleeping children, at the fire, at the full life of the place. "Look what you have done." "We," she said. "Some of it is you," he said. "Some of it you brought with you when you came, and it was always going to be you, and I want you to know that I know that." She had not had anything to say to that. She had simply been with him in the firelight and let it be true. The second child was also a boy. They named him Henry Harry in the household, almost immediately, And he arrived in the summer of 1881 with the minimum possible drama considering the circumstances, because Eva was, by now, experienced, and her approach to the entire process was the same as her approach to everything else, which was competent and thorough, and with contingency plans in place. Jacob held Harry for the first time, and Eva watched his face and thought about the first time she had seen him. That moment in the main street of Sable Creek. A man scanning for someone he was expecting, the badge catching the light, and how little she had understood then about what she was arriving into. She thought about her mother's letter, about the hidden things that had become honest things, about the anger she had felt and the love underneath the anger, and the way those two things had needed to exist together before she could reach what was on the other side. Thomas, who was too and a full and enthusiastic presence in every room he inhabited, looked at baby Harry with an expression of scientific evaluation and then said, "Small." "He will get bigger," Samuel said from the doorway. Samuel was 13 now and had grown into his length, looking more and more like a young version of Jacob with a strong thread of something else Eva was only recently recognizing as herself. Not in his features, but in his way of engaging the world, precise and observant, and with a quality of attention that was her gift to him and her mother's gift to her. "Much bigger," Clara said. Clara was 11 and had, in the past year, become the person Eva went to when she wanted a clear-eyed assessment of any situation, because Clara's observations were without sentiment but not without heart, a combination Eva found consistently useful and occasionally devastating. "I like him," Ben said decisively. Ben was 6 years old and had just recently begun to accept that none of the horses would be named Buck. He had compensated by renaming his stuffed bear, so there was that. Harry regarded them all with the wide, unfocused gaze of brand-new people, and Eva thought, "Here is your family, little one. All of them, every difficult, complicated, beloved one of them, yours." The years of the early 1880s built on themselves the way good years do, each one containing the previous ones in the way rings contain the history of a tree, so that the life became layered and dense and full. Samuel went east for school in 1882, which he had decided he wanted with the same total commitment he brought to every major decision, and the day they put him on the stage to Santa Fe was the only time Eva saw Jacob cry, brief and private and quickly collected, and she had held his hand on the return wagon ride home and said nothing, because Samuel was going to school and he was going to come back, and those were both good things. And sometimes grief and pride shared the same moment, and the best response was simply to be there for it. Samuel wrote letters home that were formal and news-dense and contained, occasionally, one sentence that was purely personal, something he had thought or noticed or felt, always at the very end of the letter, as if he had run the rest of the report to give himself reason to get there. Eva kept every letter. She wrote back at equal length and in equal density, but with one personal sentence at the beginning rather than the end, because she wanted him to know from the first line that she was thinking of him. Clara, at 12, had decided she wanted to learn medicine. She had announced this at supper one evening with the deliberateness of someone who had tested every possible counterargument in advance and found them all manageable, and she had looked at her father, and then at Eva, with an expression that contained both challenge and something else, hope, maybe, or the specific hope of a girl who needed to know that the people who loved her would not tell her no simply, because she was asking for something large. Jacob had looked at Eva and Eva had looked at Jacob, and something passed between them that required no words. "Tell me what you need to learn," Eva had said to Clara. Clara had told her. Precisely, thoroughly, with references to what she had already read and what she still needed. Eva had written to Doc Hensley the next morning about what books might be useful for a beginning student of medicine, and Doc Hensley had responded with a list and the information that he would be willing to allow Clara to observe his work on certain appropriate occasions if that would be useful. Clara had read every book on the list. She had begun her education in medicine at the age of 12 at Doc Hensley's elbow, And Doc Hensley had told Jacob privately that the girl had the steadiest nerves and clearest mind he had encountered in a student in 30 years of practice, which Jacob had reported to Eva at the kitchen table that night with the expression of a father, so proud his face could barely contain it. Ben, at 8, was learning to ride in the serious way rather than the chaotic way of young children who have always been on horses, and he had the gift for it. The instinctive communication between rider and animal that could not be entirely taught but could be cultivated. And Rooster, who had watched the Dalton horses for longer than any of the Dalton children had been alive, said that Ben was the best natural horseman he had seen in 20 years. Which was not a small thing to say, and which Ben received with the complete absence of false modesty that characterized him. He nodded, as if this was information that accorded with his existing assessment of himself, and then asked to try the young bay that Rooster had been working for 3 weeks. Rooster let him. Eva watched from the fence with her heart in her throat and her expression serene, because Ben needed to be trusted with things that were real, and Rooster was 3 feet away the whole time, and the bay was better tempered than she was afraid of, and Ben rode it in a steady circle and then brought it back to the gate with his eyes lit from the inside and said, "See." "I see," Eva said. "Well done." He grinned at her Jacob's grin, the one she had spent years collecting in all its variations. "You were scared," he said. "I was not," she said. "You were a little scared," he said, and hopped down from the horse with the easy confidence of a boy who knew exactly where he stood. She thought, as she walked back to the house, how different the world was from the one she had imagined during those months of nursing her mother, during those first terrifying weeks of independence in Cincinnati. She had imagined, when she let herself imagine at all, which was not often because imagination felt like an indulgence she could not afford, something practical and sufficient, modest comfort, enough work to sustain herself, a life that was adequate. She had not imagined Thomas at 2 years old demanding to help with the bread and getting flour in his hair and in everyone else's hair. She had not imagined Clara presenting her with a pressed flower from the mountains that she had found on the path above the north pasture, with the information that it was a species Eva had not previously catalogued, delivered with the satisfied air of a child bringing a gift exactly calibrated to the recipient. She had not imagined Jacob coming through the kitchen door in the evening and looking for her first, before anything else, before removing his hat or his coat or his badge, looking for her first, the way you look for what orients you. She had not imagined belonging so completely to a place and to a people that the idea of being anywhere else was simply not a real thing, not a deprivation, not a sacrifice, simply not real, not available, not a direction the world ran. In the spring of 1883, Eva finished the first substantial piece of writing she sent out, a long account of the water rights disputes and community formations in the New Mexico Territory, grounded in her 5 years of observation and her friendship with families across the different communities of the region. She sent it to a paper in Santa Fe that had expressed interest in territorial correspondence. They published it. They asked for more. She told Jacob at the kitchen table, and he looked at the letter from the editor with the same expression he had looked at her the first time he read her writing: recognition and satisfaction and something that had no proper name. "I told you," he said. "You told me," she agreed. "You are remarkable," he said. "We have been through this," she said. "We will continue to go through it," he said, "at regular intervals, for the foreseeable future." She rolled her eyes at him with the particular expression that she reserved for when he was being maximally certain and maximally right at the same time, and she was not willing to concede both simultaneously. "I love you," he said. "I know it," she said. "Will you go get the children? Supper is ready." He went to get the children. She set the plates. The kitchen was warm and the light was long in the summer evening way that made everything amber and permanent. And in a moment, there would be the sound of Ben coming in too fast, and Thomas immediately behind him, and Clara, with deliberate measured steps, and Jacob's voice, reminding someone of something, and Harry waking up from his nap in the back room because the noise had reached him. And all of it was coming. All of it was here. In September of 1884, Samuel came home from school for good, 20 years old and taller than Jacob, and carrying himself with a gravity that made him look entirely himself. The anger of his boyhood transformed into something measured and purposeful, a commitment to fairness that Eva recognized as the man he had been becoming for years. He had studied law. He was going to practice in Sable Creek, and from there to help with the territorial push for statehood, which was a legal and political project of long duration and considerable complexity that Samuel described at the kitchen table his first night home, with a thoroughness and precision that kept the whole family at the table, an hour past their usual bedtime because they were all listening. Ben fell asleep at the table at some point during the statehood discussion, which was just. Harry, at 3, had decided that Samuel was the most important person in the world, and spent 3 weeks following Samuel everywhere with single-minded devotion, that Samuel tolerated with a patience that spoke to how far he had come from the 9-year-old, who had crossed his arms in the yard, and given Eva the full force of his suspicion. Clara had been writing letters, over the years of her self-education, to a physician in Albuquerque, who had corresponded back with increasing interest in what she was doing and what she had learned. In 1885, at 15, she went to Albuquerque to study formally, under the supervision of this physician and his wife, who had been persuaded of the merit of the project partly by the quality of Clara's letters and partly by a visit Jacob and Eva made to Albuquerque in the spring, during which Eva had a conversation with Dr. and Mrs. Harrison that she never described to Jacob in complete detail, but that had resulted, definitively, in Clara going to study. She went with 7 books, 2 dresses, her pressed flower collection, and the steady certainty of a girl who had decided what she was going to do and had found the people who would help her do it. She wrote letters home that were clinical and detailed and contained, always, one line that was purely personal at the end, after the medicine. Eva kept those letters too. The Sable Creek Lending Library expanded. Eva's writing was published in Santa Fe, and then in Las Cruces, and once in a Chicago paper that had been reprinting Western correspondence, which had produced a letter from a Chicago reader that Eva kept because it was from a young woman in a boarding house who was trying to decide whether to go west, and she had written to ask what Eva had found when she arrived, and whether it had been worth the journey. Eva had written back at considerable length. She had told the truth about all of it, the work and the difficulty and the altitude and the loneliness that was possible even surrounded by people, and also the way the land looked in the early morning light, and the way a community built itself in the West out of need and proximity, and the willingness of strangers to become something else to each other. She had told the truth about the unexpected things, about the ways that the life you find is sometimes not the life you were looking for, and is so much more than adequate that the word adequate becomes funny in retrospect. She had not told the young woman about her mother's letter, or about Jacob, or about the particular architecture of her own coming west, because those things were hers and Jacob's, and belonged to the kitchen table and the long evenings, and the 5 years it had taken to tell the story fully even to themselves. But she had told her to go, if going was what she felt, because the West asked something of you and gave something back, and what it gave back was real. In the winter of 1885, Eva discovered she was carrying again. She told Jacob in the kitchen, in the early morning before the children were up, with the first snow of the winter coming down outside and Thomas and Harry still asleep in the back room, and Ben's boot prints tracked through the kitchen floor because Ben had been up since before dawn to see the snow, same as every winter, same as he had been since he was 4 years old. Jacob looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment, and she looked at him, and they were both sitting in the full weight of 6 years of shared life, all of it, everything that had been built and sustained and grown and occasionally survived, The 4 children and the ranch and the library and the law practice and the badge and the writing and the long evenings and all the 1,000 daily acts of love that were the actual texture of a life. And he said, "Eva." "Yes," she said. Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well, I am." She considered the word. "Happy," she said. "I am happy." It is still a slightly unfamiliar condition, and I cannot be entirely certain I am using the word correctly. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Happy," she confirmed. Definitively. The 3rd child was a girl. She arrived in the summer of 1886 in the early morning when the territory was loud with birdsong and the kitchen smelled like the bread Eva had set the night before. She came quickly and safely, as if she too had decided that drama was not the point and getting here was. She was small and alert, and had eyes that looked like her grandmother's in the only photograph Eva had of her mother. A direct, clear, fully present look that made Eva have to put her face down for a moment, because the recognition of it hit her somewhere that did not have armor. "Well," said Jacob, who was sitting beside her and had been holding her hand for 6 hours and whose expression, now that it was over and everyone was here and fine, was the most completely open thing she had ever seen on his face, all the containment gone. "What are we calling her?" Eva looked at her daughter. The baby looked back with her grandmother's eyes. "Frances," Eva said. "Frances Margaret Dalton." "For my mother." Jacob looked at her. She could see everything he was thinking because she had been reading his face for 6 years and she knew it the way she knew the land around the ranch, all of it, the light and the shadow. "Frances," he said. "Yes. Your mother would have liked that. She would have been insufferably pleased with herself," Eva said. "She would have read the situation and said she had been right all along, and I would not have been able to tell her she was wrong, which she knew perfectly well when she wrote the letter." Jacob made a sound that was the laugh and also not the laugh, something thicker and more complicated. "She was right," he said. "She was right," Eva agreed. "Do not let it go to her memory." He kissed her temple, then her forehead, then the top of Frances's head, and stayed there with his face against her hair for a long moment. And Eva held the baby in the still summer morning and felt the full weight and the full lightness of everything. The 6 years. The 4 children, the coming and staying and building, the dark past that had made her who she was and the life that had been waiting on the other side of it. And the mother who had understood her better than she had understood herself, and who had loved her enough to arrange the one thing Eva would never have let herself ask for. A family. An already built family, already waiting, already looking for her before she ever knew she was looking for them. She had come west looking for work. She had found something so much larger than work that work was simply the door she had used to walk in. The autumn of 1886 settled over the Dalton Ranch with the particular golden quality of that season in the territory, when the heat broke, and the mornings were clear and cold, and the land showed its best colors, and the light was the color of good brass and fell across everything in long, level lines. Samuel was 22, and his law practice was growing in the way that good things grow steadily, with real foundations, earning rather than claiming. He had taken on a territory case involving a family of Mexican descent whose land claim was being challenged in court by an Anglo-American speculator, and he had taken it without a fee, because his mother had once said plainly at the supper table that the law that only served those who could pay for it was not entirely functioning as designed, and Samuel had taken that in as he took most things, quietly, completely, permanently. Ben was 12 and growing into a serious horseman in the way Rooster had always said he would, and Rooster was 70-something and moving more slowly, but with no reduction in the volume or quality of his opinion on any subject. And the horses of the Dalton Ranch under his and Ben's combined management were developing a reputation in the territory that was bringing buyers from considerable distances. Thomas was 7 and had decided, apparently on principle, to be interested in everything simultaneously: the horses and the law and the writing and the medicine and the ranch accounts and the birds and the geological features of the landscape. A situation that Eva found exhausting and entirely familiar, and which Jacob managed with the steady patience of a man who understood that certain children needed to be given room to range. Harry was 5 and deeply devoted to Frances, which had not been predictable but which turned out to be the truest thing about his relationship to the world. He was a person who attached, deeply and completely, to the specific people around him, and Frances at 4 months old was apparently a specific person to him in every way that mattered. One evening in that golden autumn, Eva and Jacob sat on the back porch after supper, with Frances asleep in the indoor cradle and the older children in the house, and the stars coming out over the territory in the particular abundance that made Eva, even after 6 years, unable to take it for granted. The night was cool and the coyotes were talking to each other somewhere in the middle distance, and the horses in the near corral moved occasionally with the sounds of large, peaceful animals, and Jacob had his arm around her shoulders and she had her head against his shoulder, and neither of them was talking. He said eventually, "You are writing something. I can tell when you are composing in your head." "I am always composing in my head," she said. "What is this one?" She thought about it. "About my mother," she said. "About what she knew about me that I did not know about myself. About the fact that the most infuriating thing is not that she was right, she was clearly right, but that she had to be right about me from a distance, in a letter to a man she had never met because she was dying and there was no other way." He was quiet because he understood what she was saying. "I would like her to have known," Eva said. "I would like her to have known this, all of it, the house and the children and you, particularly you." "She would have terrified me," Jacob said. "Absolutely," Eva said. "She was magnificent. You would have respected each other enormously, and she would have made your life difficult on principle, because she believed that difficulty built character." "She raised you," he said. "She raised me." "Then she understood what she was doing," he said. "I think she did know. I think people who love someone that well," he paused. "I think they know." Eva was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to write it as a story, a true one, about coming west and about what was already here waiting, about mothers and letters and the lives arranged for us by love we did not ask for." "You should write it," he said. "I intend to." "You always intend to, and then you do." "Yes," she said. "That is how things get done." He kissed her. She let him. The stars were very close over the territory, and the night was full of the sounds of a world going about its business. And inside the house the children were exactly where they ought to be, and the baby was asleep, and the ranch was the shape it had become over 6 years of daily investment. And all of it, every thread of it, was resolved and real and thoroughly, completely hers. She had come west looking for work. She had found a family that was already looking for her. And she had stayed and built and loved and been loved in return, and written it all down so that it would last beyond the two of them, so that Frances someday and Harry and Thomas and all of them would know the story of how it had begun, with a letter from a dying woman who understood her daughter, and a widowed sheriff in the territory who had the wisdom to recognize what he was being given, and a young woman who packed a carpetbag and a cast-iron skillet and boarded a train heading west and arrived, without knowing it, exactly where she had always been going. The last letter her mother had ever written was folded in Eva's desk, preserved carefully, read so many times she knew it by heart. She would show it to Frances someday, when Frances was old enough to understand the kind of love that plans ahead, the kind that arranges the future from its own ending, the kind that says, "I know who you are and I know what you need, and I will make it so that you find it even when I cannot be there to see." That was the love Eva had been given. That was the love she intended to give back. The autumn deepened into winter, and the winter became the spring of 1887, and the Dalton Ranch and the Dalton family and the town of Sable Creek went on becoming what they were daily, deliberately together. And the story of how it had begun became part of the foundation that everything else was built on, solid as the desert rock, and just as permanent. And Eva Atwood Dalton, who had come west looking for work and found herself found, went on writing it all down.